Hello, everybody, and welcome to our notes about conduction, convection, and radiation, also sometimes called heat transfer or thermal energy transfer. Swabat! Students will be able to explain the process of conduction, convection, and radiation and give real-world examples about how these work. As I said just a second ago, thermal heat energy is kind of sometimes also referred to as conduction, convection, and radiation. So thermal or heat energy is energy that is created by a source and measured by heat. And it can be transferred or moved. So heat can move from one thing to another. And that's where conduction, convection, and radiation come in. Those are the three ways that heat can move or be transferred. So there are three ways. And this picture kind of shows all three of them. I'm going to talk about this picture some more in just a minute. But conduction, convection, and radiation. Hopefully one of those words you remember from previous units. We've talked about one of these before. The first one we're going to talk about is conduction. Conduction is the movement of heat or electricity through matter using direct contact. Direct contact meaning touching. The heat moves from one thing touching another thing. So direct contact means touching. And then a couple of subcategories here, sub-definitions. A conductor is something that moves heat well. So an example of a good conductor is a metal object. Will move heat through it well. An insulator is something that does not allow heat to move easily through it, like wood, glass, plastic, styrofoam. Certain things do not allow heat to move through it quickly. So we've got a conductor and an insulator. Examples of conduction: an iron on clothing. So like that iron is directly touching the fabric. So the heat is moving from the iron to the thing that it's touching. A pan. So we've got heat touching the pan, making the pan hot, and then anything in the pan is going to get hot because it's touching the pan. A spoon in hot liquid. So the spoon is going to get hot because it's touching something that's hot. So the heat will move through that by touching. So that's some examples of conduction. The next one is convection. And convection is the one that I hope that you remember that we've talked about before. It is the transfer of heat through a gas or a liquid. And it is due to differences in density. So hot fluid or air rises while cold fluid or air sinks. So liquids or gases, and it's due to differences in density. Examples. My first example is like soup in a pot. It's going to get hot from the bottom of the pan. The warm fluid rises to the top because it becomes less dense. And then the cooler fluid sinks to the bottom because it's more dense, and that cycle continues. We've talked about this. We've talked about convection with the ocean currents, with density in ocean currents, especially deep ocean currents. The mantle, we talked about it with the mantle. We talked about it with plate tectonics, that that's how the plates move, is because of convection in the mantle. It also works in a hot air balloon. So this fire is heating up air. The air rises, which makes the balloon go higher. All right, the final way that heat can be transferred is called radiation. So in radiation, energy is transmitted in waves or particles, and it can travel through space or other types of matter. So conduction is mostly found in solids, things touching each other. Convection happens in fluids and in gases, and radiation can happen in space. So the main example of radiation is sun. The heat that we get from the sun travels through space and comes to Earth in the form of waves, radiation waves from the sun. So that's what keeps everything alive, right? Is the heat and the light that we get from the sun. Heat from a fire would be kind of the same thing. If you have a fire and you're standing next to the fire, that heat is traveling through waves to reach your hands or your body. Heat from a candle, kind of the same thing. So radiation is heat that's coming through space to leave that object and go to something else. All right, so here is my example again. This was at the beginning of the show. I just want to point out all three different kinds. We've got conduction, like touching this hot handle of the pan. We would also have conduction if the pan was on the stove burner, because that heat would be directly touching the pan. So we've got conduction a couple of places. We've got convection, where the pan is heating up the liquid inside the pan. Those molecules rise because they're less dense. The cooler molecules sink because they're more dense, so that's convection. And then we've got just like the heat coming off of the stove. If you were standing next to it or put your hand next to it, that heat is traveling in waves from that heat source. So those are the three ways that heat can transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. All right, so here's our meme. So he's kind of joking about standing next to a heater. Which form of energy transfer is it? Please make sure you take good notes today. And as always, science rocks.